On a warm afternoon in August of 1901, two women stepped through a sunlit garden archway and walked straight into history. Their names were Charlotte and Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, both respected British academics visiting the Palace of Versailles. They had traveled to France to study architecture and gather cultural notes, but what they experienced in the gardens behind the palace would become one of the most debated paranormal encounters of the 20th century. They would later write that they didn't simply feel lost in time. They felt removed from it. As they crossed through a tree-lined path behind the Petit Trianon estate, they noticed something strange. The atmosphere changed. The breeze stopped. The sunlight dimmed. Birds that had been chirping moments earlier fell silent, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The air became heavy, thick with stillness, like oxygen was suddenly replaced by something dense and unmoving. Moberly would later describe it as walking into a painting, flat, muted, oppressive, unreal. The path ahead seemed familiar but wrong, like a memory half remembered. Then, without knowing it, without intending it, they crossed the threshold. A step that would turn them into the center of one of the strangest mysteries in modern paranormal history. The Versailles time slip. At first, it was only subtle things. A gardener pushing a wheelbarrow, but moving slowly, mechanically, almost like an actor waiting for his cue. Two men in faded green coats and tricorn hats appeared near a bridge, staring at them with stern expressions. Their clothing was wrong, not just old-fashioned, but precisely accurate to late 18th century French uniforms. Moberly, unaware of the strange temporal shift, asked them for directions to the Petit Trianon house. Instead of responding, the men spoke to each other in Old French, their accents thick, foreign, archaic. Jourdain felt a sudden wave of dizziness. She later described the sensation as walking underwater. As they rounded a path, the scent of tobacco and gunpowder lingered in the air, impossible smells in a modern manicured garden. Then, at the far edge of the lawn, seated beneath a parasol, was a woman dressed in a pale green silk gown. She sat perfectly still, sketching on a pad as if frozen in time. Her dress was not a costume, not theatrical, it was real. Intricate embroidery. Layers of lace. A style that vanished more than a century earlier. And when the woman finally lifted her head and looked at them, Moberly felt her stomach drop. She recognized the woman, not from life, but from history books. Marie Antoinette. Charlotte froze. She stared at the woman under the parasol, her breath caught in her throat. The silk gown shimmered as if lit from within, yet the surrounding air remained unnaturally dim, almost colorless. Jourdain later wrote that the entire landscape looked flat and two-dimensional, like a painted backdrop. The woman's face was powdered, framed by an elaborate coiffure pinned with pearls, and her expression was distant, preoccupied, almost melancholic. Jourdain whispered, "Do you see her?" Charlotte nodded slowly, unable to speak. The woman looked up, and in that moment, Charlotte felt a jolt of panic, not fear of the woman, but fear of reality itself. The figure seemed too real and too still, as if time had stopped around her. They both sensed something was deeply wrong. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, the woman disappeared. No footsteps. No sound. One blink and she was simply gone. The path ahead shifted again. Light flooded back into the garden. A distant lawnmower rumbled. Birdsong returned. The world snapped into motion. But the two women stood frozen in place, unable to fully comprehend what they had witnessed. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a hallucination. They had not seen an apparition. They had walked into another century. When they finally returned to the streets of Versailles, both women felt drained, as if they had crossed some invisible threshold and left part of themselves behind. They said nothing to each other at first. It was too strange, too absurd to even speak aloud. Academics don't claim to see time slips. Professors don't admit to walking into the past. Yet that night, in their hotel room, Moberly turned to Jourdain and whispered the confession they were both afraid to say. "Did you feel that something was wrong?" Jourdain exhaled slowly. "We weren't in our own time." Their journals from that night reveal identical details. Same people, same clothing, same oppressive atmosphere. as if both had observed the event from two separate vantage points. For the next 10 years, they kept their secret. They feared ridicule, the loss of their academic careers, or worse, being thought insane. But the memory gnawed at them. The way the colors drained from the world. The stillness of the air. The sensation of being observed. The woman with the parasol whose face both instantly recognized from portraits. In 1911, they did the unthinkable. They published a book documenting everything. An adventure. The world laughed. Then investigators went to Versailles and discovered something that changed everything. When an adventure was published, critics dismissed it as fantasy. Two women misremembering a stroll through a garden. Newspapers mocked them, suggesting the ladies simply had heat stroke. But then something unexpected happened. Cartographers and historians began to study the women's descriptions of pathways, buildings, and bridges they claimed to have walked through that day. There was a problem. Those structures didn't exist in 1901. A bridge they described had been torn down in 1792. A small shed they mentioned was only present on maps from Marie Antoinette's private garden, more than a century earlier. Even the exact spot where Moberly claimed to see the woman drawing, a small terrace overlooking a lawn, was accurate only to the 18th century. The modern layout didn't match their account at all. In 1901, the path they walked on didn't exist. But it appeared on estate maps from the 1770s. Historians began asking the same question. How could two women describe a landscape perfectly, when its design had vanished before either of them was born? The more investigators dug, the stranger it became. Eyewitness testimonies surfaced from staff and visitors claiming that certain areas of the Versailles gardens felt wrong. Sudden drops in temperature. Echoes without source. Unexplained silence, even when crowds were nearby. Some reported seeing people dressed in elaborate 18th century clothing near the Petit Trianon, only to have them vanish moments later. One gardener, decades later, admitted privately that some nights he refused to walk that part of the estate. He said he felt watched by people who weren't there. Researchers studying the Moberly, Jourdain event coined a term for what they believed happened. A time slip, a spontaneous rupture where two moments in history overlap. And if a time slip occurred once, could it happen again? Could Versailles be more than a palace? Could it be a doorway? In 1913, 2 years after the book was released, a French archivist uncovered something that shook even the skeptics. He found an old portrait inventory from Versailles describing Marie Antoinette visiting the Petit Trianon on the exact afternoon Moberly and Jourdain claimed to have seen her, August 10, 1792, the day before she was seized by revolutionaries. That date aligned with the Queen's final private outing before imprisonment. But another detail chilled researchers. Marie Antoinette was documented as sketching in the garden that afternoon. Sketching. Just as the women described. She had been trying to escape stress from the revolution, drawing quietly by the lawn near the terrace. The very terrace that no longer existed in 1901 but was present in 1792 architectural plans. Historians now faced a bizarre reality. Every detail the women described, the clothing, the layout, the objects, even the mood, matched the historical records of that moment. There was no reason 20th century school administrators should have known any of this. Unless they didn't read about history. Unless they walked into it. Yet the most unsettling evidence emerged decades later. In the 1950s, a restoration project uncovered the exact small bridge Moberly and Jourdain claimed they crossed, buried under soil where modern garden maps showed nothing. Workers found ancient cobblestones and remnants of the old path, hidden for over a century. When researchers compared the women's handwritten journals to blueprints from 1789, the alignment was perfect, down to the angle of the path and position of the terrace. Cartographers ran the data again and again. Impossible. Illogical. Unless the women were telling the truth. Architectural evidence continued to validate their story. Even the uniforms of the men in green coats matched the outfits of the King's Swiss Guards, whose barracks were destroyed during the Revolution. Moberly and Jourdain didn't have access to such archival detail. And yet, they described it perfectly. Piece by piece, The ridicule faded, replaced by something far more disturbing. What if the boundary between time isn't fixed? What if certain places, certain moments, overlap? Not by accident, but because history remembers. In the decades that followed, researchers began collecting strange testimonies from other visitors to Versailles, stories so similar they could not be dismissed. A Parisian soldier on leave claimed he heard distant harpsichord music while walking near Petit Trianon, yet when he approached, the music stopped instantly, as if cut mid-note. A honeymooning couple photographed a woman sweeping in front of the Queen's temple wearing outdated clothing and a cloth bonnet. When they approached to ask for directions, she simply walked behind a hedge and vanished. The photo they took later showed an empty garden. No woman. No broom. Just an unbroken line of hedges. Another story came from a Versailles tour guide in the 1970s. After locking the gates one night, he swore he heard laughter, delicate and distant, echoing from the gardens. It sounded like a party. He followed the noise to the edge of the Petit Trianon, where he saw candlelight flickering behind the windows. Shadows danced across the curtains, human silhouettes, moving rhythmically, as if waltzing. But when he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the building was dark. Completely empty. No candles. No music. No people. Just cold, unmoving air. He quit 2 days later. A pattern emerged. The sightings always happened in the same area. The pathways around the Petit Trianon and the Queen's Hamlet. The exact place where Moberly and Jourdain stepped into another time. In 1982, a physicist named Geoffrey Kington proposed a theory that stirred the scientific community. He suggested that historical trauma, especially trauma tied to powerful emotion, could create temporal imprints, echoes of time layered over a place. He called them residual pockets of history, like grooves on a record, like moments trapped in a loop. Versailles was the perfect pressure point: revolution, betrayal, death, and the fall of a monarchy. A location soaked in emotional energy. What if emotion is not just felt, but stored? What if time is not a straight line, but a place? And sometimes, certain people walk into it? Researchers began referring to the Versailles event by a name that carried far more weight than hallucination or misinterpretation. They called it the Versailles time slip. In 1995, a researcher digging through the private archives of the palace found something shocking: an internal memo from a Versailles historian dated 1928, referencing the Moberly, Jourdain incident. The memo warned staff not to discuss unusual atmospheric disturbances reported by gardeners and servants near the Petit Trianon. It mentioned abrupt silence, visual distortions, intense emotion unrelated to present time. Visual distortions. Emotion that isn't yours. The historian wrote that multiple employees had described walking from summer heat into cold air, as though through a curtain. A curtain, the exact word Moberly and Jourdain used. When the researcher requested copies of the testimonies, he was told the documents were transferred to another archive. When he pursued the trail, the archive denied ever receiving them. The existence of the memo confirmed one thing: Versailles knew strange things were happening, and someone wanted to keep those records hidden. It wasn't just employees. A Belgian physicist touring the Petit Trianon in 2002 reported feeling a sudden drop in temperature, so sharp that his glasses fogged. He described the world around him as flattened, like he'd stepped into a painting. A woman in 18th-century dress crossed the path ahead of him, holding a basket of flowers. He greeted her in French. She didn't respond, she simply kept walking, feet making no sound on the gravel. He watched her turn a corner. He followed, and the path ended against a blank wall of hedges. No opening. No trail. No woman. He wrote in his trip journal, "I think I walked into another time. I do not have the language to explain it." Scientists who later reviewed time-slip accounts noticed a repeating pattern. Sudden silence. Change in color and depth. Drop in temperature. Feeling of being watched. People or objects behaving like actors in a loop. Not one witness described the event as ghostly. Every one of them described it as real. As if they didn't see history. They entered it. As interest in the Versailles incident grew, a new hypothesis emerged. One that didn't rely on ghosts or imagination, but physics. A quantum researcher from MIT proposed that the Petit Trianon might sit on a naturally occurring temporal weak spot, a location where the boundary between timelines becomes thin, similar to how rips appear in stressed fabric. He pointed to magnetic anomalies recorded around the estate in 1989 and again in 1997. The sensors used to study lightning storms detected sharp electromagnetic spikes, not in the sky, but at ground level, near the very path Moberly and Jourdain described. He suggested that a time slip could occur the same way gravity bends light. If conditions were perfect, electromagnetic instability, emotional resonance, pressure changes, time could twist. The past wouldn't just be remembered. It could be accessed. Moberly and Jourdain didn't see ghosts. They stepped into another layer of reality. To test this theory, the researcher traveled to Versailles with specialized equipment during the same August week of the original 1901 incident. He recorded a sudden 8-degree temperature drop and a spike in magnetic variance, impossible to recreate anywhere else on the grounds. His instruments malfunctioned. His watch stopped for 62 seconds. And when the data was downloaded later, the timestamp showed August 10, 1901. Around the same time, another discovery surfaced. Letters written by a young gardener employed at Versailles in 1901. Preserved in a private family attic, the letters described seeing two strangely dressed women near the Petit Trianon. He wrote, "They looked lost, as if searching for someone. We are told not to speak to visitors acting strangely. The housekeeper says the Queen dislikes disturbance." He dated the letter August 10, 1901. The same day. The same location. The same women. He ended with a detail that aligned perfectly with Moberly and Jourdain's account. "A woman with large hat and white dress sketched by the lake. A servant called her Madame Antoine." Madame Antoine? Marie Antoinette's nickname. The women didn't imagine the time slip. Someone on the other side saw them. For decades, the Versailles time slip remained a strange footnote in paranormal literature, until a locked archival box surfaced during a renovation of the French Ministry of Culture in 1993. Inside were documents stamped Classified, Armée Française, Temporal Anomaly/Petit Trianon. A historian who handled the files, before they were seized and resealed, described them anonymously. According to his statement, the box contained witness reports dating back to 1789 describing people in strange clothing appearing, then vanishing near the Trianon. A sketch made by a Versailles groundskeeper in 1901 showing two women in Edwardian dress, confused, standing near the Queen's Hamlet. Handwritten notes by a French officer, dated 1928, stating, "The location is unstable. Do not send soldiers alone." The most disturbing document was a report from 1967, filed by a military physicist investigating unexplained electromagnetic fields on the grounds. His final conclusion: "The Petit Trianon is not haunted. It is leaking time." He submitted the report. 2 weeks later, the project was shut down. The physicist was reassigned. The archive sealed. Someone in authority wanted the anomaly buried. In 2015, a Parisian tour guide came forward claiming that tourists still reported time distortions in the gardens, silence falling abruptly, colors changing, footsteps echoing when no one is there. Many described the same sensation as Moberly and Jourdain. "It felt as though we were being watched from another era." One visitor recorded audio while walking near the Petit Trianon. Playback revealed harpsichord music, faint but unmistakable, despite no concerts occurring on the grounds that day. Analysis confirmed the sound wasn't modern piano but consistent with 18th century French chamber music. When she emailed the Versailles administration requesting comment, they replied, "There are no scheduled performances at that location. The recording contains environmental artifacts." Artifacts. Not explanation. But the witness insisted on her final statement. "I don't think we heard ghosts. I think we heard time still happening." And so the question deepened, not whether the past left an imprint, but whether it can still be entered. Years after publishing an adventure, the friendship between Moberly and Jourdain began to fracture, not because they doubted each other, but because they began to fear what they had revealed. In 1924, a second edition of their book was prepared with new material, but before printing, several pages vanished from the manuscript. These missing pages reportedly contained a confession. One of the women, readers later speculated it was Moberly, returned alone to Versailles in an attempt to force another time slip. The surviving correspondence suggests she believed she was being pulled back by something that wasn't finished. A preserved letter from Moberly to Jourdain, dated November 1923, reads, "It was not an accident. We were called." Jourdain's response was cold and terrified. "Do not go back. The door may close behind you." 3 weeks later, according to library records from the Society for Psychical Research, Moberly checked out maps of Versailles stamped with restricted access. In the margins she wrote a simple phrase: "The path appears when one stops looking for it." What happened on that return visit was never recorded. Moberly stopped writing about Versailles entirely. She spoke of it only once more, on her deathbed. Jourdain, however, did not let it go. She allegedly began research into temporal displacement, believing that time functioned like overlapping layers of transparent film. According to her private notes, released by Oxford after her death, she believed certain locations act like weak seams in time, thin places, where eras brush against each other. In those notes, she described episodes of déjà vu, missing time, and, in one entry, seeing the same man twice in different clothing, both times near Christ Church Meadow at Oxford. She became paranoid that someone was following her, not from the present, but from the past. 2 months later, in 1924, Jourdain died suddenly. The death certificate listed heart failure. Yet the nurse on duty claimed Jourdain spent her final hours calling out in French and crying that the garden was opening again. Her final written sentence was found on her desk. "Versailles is not in the past. It is adjacent." The missing pages of their manuscript were never found. But rumors persist that the French Ministry of Culture seized them. Not because they were nonsense, but because they were too accurate. In the years that followed, the Versailles time slip became one of the most heavily debated cases in paranormal history. Skeptics argued that the women must have misinterpreted a historical reenactment, a private event, or play actors. But every attempt to prove that theory fell apart. No records of any reenactment exist for that afternoon, no costumed actors were permitted on palace grounds in 1901, and the path the women walked has never appeared on any map. Not even once. Historians re-examined the palace archives in the 1970s and uncovered something more disturbing. The location where Moberly claimed to see the grieving woman, wearing Marie Antoinette's signature hairstyle, was directly adjacent to the exact section where Antoinette sketched at her desk the day before her arrest in 1792. Even stranger, there was no documentation of the kiosk, the man with the pockmarked face, or the 2 gatekeepers anywhere in the palace's construction plans. Not in 1901, not in 1792. They existed only in Moberly and Jourdain's testimony. The Society for Psychical Research later classified the incident as a collective temporal hallucination, a term invented solely because no scientific explanation fit. Yet neither woman ever wavered. Both went to the grave insisting, "We were not imagining the past. We were inside it." Today, tourists walk the same wooded path near the Petit Trianon, laughing, taking photos, unaware that 2 women once stepped through a tear in time there. Groundskeepers still report odd sightings, a sudden drop in temperature, the scent of antique perfume, shadows in 18th century dress. A Versailles tour guide once joked to a camera crew that, "Sometimes the gardens play tricks on you." When asked what she meant, she paused and finally whispered, "Sometimes the path is there. And sometimes it isn't." Every year, at least a dozen visitors report strange anomalies, silence that drops like a curtain, a sudden disorientation, or figures in outdated clothing walking just ahead on a path that wasn't there seconds earlier. Most chilling of all, one investigator placed ground-penetrating radar along the path from the Moberly, Jourdain map. The results revealed a buried structure, shaped like a small pavilion, exactly where the two women claimed they saw Marie Antoinette. A structure that has not existed for over 200 years. Whether the women slipped into the past, or the past slipped into the present, remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. And somewhere, deep inside the gardens of Versailles, when the conditions are just right, the path appears again.